On January 12, 1945, German intelligence officers along the Vistula River in Poland compiled their weekly assessment of Soviet capabilities. The Eastern Front had stabilized after autumn offensives. Soviet forces occupied bridgeheads on the western bank of the Vistula, but showed limited indication of major offensive preparation. Luftwaffe reconnaissance was limited by fuel shortages and Allied air superiority, and detected what appeared to be routine defensive activity. Radio intercepts suggested routine operations. The assessment concluded that Soviet forces, exhausted from previous campaigns, would likely remain defensive through the winter. German reserves were positioned elsewhere, particularly in Hungary and on the Western Front. 2 days later, on January 14, 1945, Soviet artillery opened fire across a 300-kilometer front. The bombardment lasted 25 minutes and struck German positions with unprecedented density. Then came the infantry and the armor. The Soviet fronts had concentrated over 2 million soldiers for the offensive, including massive forces concealed inside the Vistula bridgeheads that German intelligence had assessed as containing limited defensive deployments. 7 Soviet armies attacked simultaneously. Within 48 hours, German defensive lines had collapsed. Within 3 weeks, Soviet forces advanced over 400 kilometers and reached the Oder River, less than 60 kilometers from Berlin. This was not fortunate timing or unexpected German weakness. The Soviets had spent 6 weeks moving massive forces into attack positions, while German reconnaissance, though degraded, still observed the sectors. Thousands of tanks and self-propelled guns had moved into concealed assembly areas far closer to the front than German intelligence believed possible. The deception that enabled the Vistula to Oder offensive represented systematic concealment, allowing the final drive toward Berlin to begin from positions German commanders believed were quiet sectors. Standard German intelligence procedures in January 1945 remained systematic despite deteriorating conditions. Luftwaffe reconnaissance, though reduced by fuel shortages and Allied air superiority, still photographed Soviet positions when possible. Ground observers monitored visible enemy activity. Radio intercepts tracked Soviet communications. Intelligence officers analyzed available information to assess enemy capabilities. The system had provided warnings for previous Soviet offensives, but operational constraints increasingly limited collection effectiveness. The scale of force concentration required for the Vistula to Oder offensive made concealment extraordinarily difficult. Moving armies required massive logistics. Each force needed thousands of vehicles for supplies. Tank corps required fuel convoys. Artillery units demanded ammunition transport. The physical signatures of military concentration created patterns that reconnaissance should detect. German intelligence officers understood these signatures from years of Eastern Front experience. German assessments in early January acknowledged Soviet forces occupied bridgeheads on the western Vistula bank. These bridgeheads, established during autumn 1944, were recognized as potential jumping-off positions. Intelligence monitored them for signs of buildup. What assessments concluded was that forces in the bridgeheads appeared defensive and insufficient for major offensive operations. The expectation was that any future Soviet offensive would require visible buildup that intelligence would detect. Yet between late November 1944 and mid-January 1945, Soviet forces moved massive strength into bridgehead positions, while German intelligence continued assessing the sectors as containing limited forces. The assessments reflected what degraded reconnaissance capabilities could observe, rather than what actually existed on the ground. Soviet planning began in autumn 1944. Marshal Zhukov, commanding the 1st Belarusian Front, and Marshal Konev, commanding the 1st Ukrainian Front, would launch the main attacks. The operational concept required concentrating overwhelming force in bridgeheads to achieve a breakthrough, then exploiting rapidly toward the Oder and Berlin. Success required surprise. German reserves, if alerted, could reinforce threatened sectors. The solution was systematic Maskirovka doctrine, refined through years of operations. Soviet procedures treated operational security as an integrated component of offensive planning. Movement, supply, communications all followed protocols designed to defeat German reconnaissance. Movement into bridgeheads occurred exclusively during darkness and limited visibility. Units moved during hours when aerial reconnaissance could not observe. Marching schedules ensured units reached concealment before dawn. Routes avoided areas where daytime movement might be observed. The prohibition on daylight movement was enforced rigidly. Concealment. During daylight required systematic discipline. Soviet forces positioned in forests, villages, and terrain offering overhead cover. Vehicles were dispersed to prevent density signatures. Camouflage discipline extended to individual soldiers. Troops remained in concealed positions throughout daylight hours. Radio silence was maintained throughout movement phases. Units moving into bridgeheads operated under complete radio silence. Command functioned through courier and landline communications. Radio deception units maintained normal traffic patterns in sectors forces were leaving, creating the false impression of continued presence. Supply operations posed acute challenges. Moving thousands of tons of supplies into bridgeheads without creating visible dumps or vehicle traffic required systematic procedures. Logistics officers established supply points in concealed locations. Convoys moved during darkness. Supplies were dispersed immediately rather than stockpiled in locations that would appear in aerial photographs. Artillery concentration was particularly difficult. The offensive required massing thousands of guns. Artillery positions were surveyed and prepared during darkness. Ammunition was dispersed in small caches. Firing positions were prepared under cover. These preparations occurred without German counter-battery intelligence detecting the scale of the buildup. Tanks and mechanized forces represented massive armored strength. Thousands of tanks moved into assembly areas far closer to the front than German assessments predicted. Soviet forces dispersed armor across multiple locations within the bridgeheads. Vehicles were positioned under cover. The dispersion prevented concentration signatures while maintaining the ability to mass forces once the offensive began. German reconnaissance continued when operational conditions permitted. Luftwaffe units flew missions when weather and fuel availability allowed. Aerial photographs showed the bridgehead areas. Intelligence officers examined photographs systematically. What they observed were defensive positions, normal activity levels, and force densities consistent with defensive deployments. The photographs showed what Soviet Maskirovka procedures ensured they would show. Ground observers monitoring bridgehead sectors reported defensive activity matching previous patterns. Patrols operated normally. Artillery fired routine defensive missions. Nothing suggested forces were preparing major offensive operations. The observable activity was designed to appear routine, while actual offensive buildup occurred in ways that minimized observable signatures. German intelligence assessments in early January reflected this analysis combined with reduced reconnaissance capability. Reports acknowledged Soviet forces occupied bridgeheads and would eventually use them for offensive operations. But assessments concluded that a major offensive would require a visible buildup that had not been detected. Force levels appeared insufficient for operations beyond limited attacks. German reserves remained positioned for other threats. On January 14th at 0800 hours, Soviet artillery opened fire. The bombardment struck German positions across the entire front simultaneously. The density was overwhelming. German positions that intelligence had assessed as facing limited Soviet forces were engaged by artillery concentrations indicating massive offensive preparation. Soviet infantry and armor attacked following the bombardment. The assault came from forces far exceeding intelligence predictions. German defenders, positioned based on assessments of limited enemy strength, confronted attacking forces of a scale they were not prepared to contain. Defensive positions designed for assessed threats were overwhelmed. German defensive lines collapsed rapidly. Units could not contain the actual offensive. Reserves positioned elsewhere could not redeploy quickly enough. Soviet forces achieved breakthroughs across multiple sectors simultaneously. The offensive that intelligence had assessed as not imminent had begun with overwhelming force. Within 48 hours, Soviet forces penetrated over 100 kilometers in some sectors. German attempts to establish defensive lines failed as Soviet mobile forces exploited breakthroughs. The advance continued through January at UN-precedented winter rates. Soviet forces liberated Warsaw on January 17th. By early February, lead elements reached the Oder River. An advance of over 400 kilometers in 3 weeks brought Soviet forces within 60 kilometers of Berlin. The deception demonstrated that force concentration could be achieved through systematic suppression of observable signatures, even under continuous observation. Soviet maskirovka procedures operated at a scale sufficient to conceal armies in bridgeheads German intelligence monitored. Coordination across fronts, the discipline maintained by hundreds of thousands of troops, and systematic procedures applied to every aspect of operations combined to defeat reconnaissance that remained functional but analytically limited by reduced capabilities. The psychological dimension was significant. German commanders facing a deteriorating situation calculated they had time before the next major Soviet offensive. Assessments suggesting visible buildup would precede attacks created an expectation of a warning period. This expectation proved incorrect when Soviet forces attacked from positions assessed as containing insufficient strength. The Vistula-Oder offensive opened the final approach to Berlin. Soviet forces positioned on the Oder would launch the final assault in April. The rapid advance occurred because operational surprise allowed breakthrough before German reserves could respond effectively. On January 12, 1945, German intelligence along the Vistula assessed Soviet bridgeheads as containing forces insufficient for major offensive operations. Reduced reconnaissance capability, fuel shortages, and disrupted Luftwaffe operations reinforced the assessment that sectors were quiet. 2 days later, the Soviet fronts attacked with over 2 million soldiers, including massive forces that had been concentrated in those bridgeheads without full detection. Within 3 weeks, Soviet forces advanced more than 400 kilometers and reached the Oder River, positioning for the final assault on Berlin. The deception worked because Soviet maskirovka procedures were designed to defeat German reconnaissance methods even when degraded. Movement occurred during periods when observation could not function. Supply operations minimized visible signatures. Communications were controlled to prevent radio intelligence detection. The systematic coordination created conditions where German intelligence, operating with reduced capabilities, observed activity appearing defensive, while offensive preparation occurred in ways designed to be unobservable. German reconnaissance operated under severe constraints by January 1945. Intelligence officers applied systematic analysis to available information. They were defeated because Soviet operational security was designed around German collection capabilities and their known limitations. That was the Vistula-Oder deception. The offensive that opened the road to Berlin launched from positions German intelligence believed were quiet.